welcome all of you to the last panel of the day. So hang in there with us, and keep in mind that some of our panelists online are in Asia, and therefore it's the middle of the night where they are. So bravo to them, especially for joining us. This panel is focused on energy security and climate change. And as was discussed this morning, climate, energy, and sustainable development issues have traditionally, for many years now, been an important focus of the G7 summits, and that stands to reason. These are enormously important global challenges that demand leadership from the G7, and they have also addressed energy issues and climate change issues together in their communiques in an integrated way, which of course makes a lot of sense. So as we look to the challenge for the Canadian presidency for this upcoming summit and the challenge of finding common ground in this context, the theme of energy security has emerged as a potential area of common ground. So this panel is going to discuss how to frame climate and energy security in a way that really brings in the right kind of aspects of the interconnections between climate change and energy security. Both the opportunities, for example, in renewable energy for reducing security risks and increasing energy security, as well as the risks presented by climate change for security questions. And so we'll ask the question to our panelists: what should the G7 deliver in commitments to address energy security and climate change, and what are the consequences for its global leadership if it does not? So we'll look at the link between security, conflict and fragility, and climate change, as well as opportunities for G7 leadership on the imperatives of sustainable and resilient supply chains, particularly in the area of critical minerals that are so important for clean energy expansion. So we've got a great panel here. I'll start. I'll just quickly introduce them to you. You've got their bios, of course, in your materials, but I'll start with one of my co-chairs on this task force, Sébastien Treillet. He is the Executive Director for the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, or IDRI, in Paris. So thank you very much for joining, Sébastien. And then here on the stage with me is Professor Ian Rowlands. He's with the School of Environment, Resources and Sustainability here in Waterloo at the University of Waterloo. And he has research, teaching, and community interests in energy transitions, as well as in global, national, and local climate governance. And then back to online, we have Professor Syed Munir Khasroo, who is the chairman of the Institute for Policy Advocacy and Governance, or IPAG. And Professor Khasroo has been very active in the G7 and G20 processes. He's led around 25 policy briefs and co-chaired task forces for both the G7 and G20 processes. Then back to the stage here, pleased to introduce Sarah Birch. She's a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management, also at the University of Waterloo. She's the Canada Research Chair of Sustainability, Governance and Innovation, and she is the Executive Director of the Waterloo Climate Institute. Now we're missing Bam Bang, who was with us earlier today. Maybe he's had enough of Waterloo panels. Hopefully he'll come back. And then we have Michael Weisberg, who is the Bess Hyman President's Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Deputy Director of Perry World House at the University of Pennsylvania. And then we have Riyad Medeb, who is the Director of the Sustainable Energy Hub at the United Nations Development Program, or the UNDP. So thank you very much, those of you online, for joining, and thank you to Ian and Sarah for being here with me on the stage. And so we'll jump right in and go to the first off with the question of the framing of this topic. So how can we think about framing of energy security and climate change together? So I'm going to ask Sébastien to lead off with that question, please. Go ahead, Sébastien.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you very much for the organizers to make it possible to participate from Paris. I think one of the key elements that I want to put on the table is the formal commitments of the G7 on these issues, to show how contentious they might be in the current context and why we need to go towards a definition of energy security. The G7 was supposed to have phased out fossil fuel subsidies by 2025, and this has not happened. And so that is going to be, of course, a very contentious issue. But I should think also that the G7 could be expected to lead on the Dubai commitments of COP28 that are linked to what was the report of the International Energy Agency before COP28, and that was that we need to triple renewables, double energy efficiency, and transition away from fossil fuels. Again, these are elements where the G7 would be expected to be able to lead on those commitments. The G7 countries would be expected to lead on those, and in particular because if they lead, they pave the way, but they also, because of the size of their markets, they could have important effects in terms of the reducing the cost of the technology. But as you said, Patricia, this is not easy to be framed as an area for convergence between the G7 countries. I nevertheless believe that energy security is something that is quite interesting. I heard that when the current head of the US Department of Energy came to Brussels, that was a very positive conversation. That was not in the media, because in the media it's much more easy to find all the contentious issues than the ones on which we can cooperate. And I really believe that there are avenues of cooperation on these issues of spreading renewables, because a lot of the businesses in the US and in Canada, Japan, and the other G7 countries are developing lots of technologies linked to renewables, but also on the grid. The connectivity issue is something that is very important once you develop the renewables, and both for energy security in Europe, we know that we see how important connectivity investments and infrastructure investments are. But it's also I would say that seen from Europe, a very important issue would be efficiency, and even I would go to sufficiency. But sufficiency might not be an area on energy demand management where we could find a common ground. But at least on energy efficiency, this is something that is extremely important and on which G7 countries might be quite interested to lead. So this, I think, is how important it is for me to think of energy security in terms of securing the supply, but also looking at dependencies. So reducing the demand is something that we should try to look forward. And I would probably finish this first introduction on the part of energy security. I know that I haven't in my talk. I wouldn't have spoken on the climate risks, but I wanted to finish by saying that on this issue of dependencies, it's extremely important that we try and see how there can be a kind of an alignment between the G7 countries on energy security, stability, avoiding volatility, avoiding that in the supply chains there is too much risks, and the best way for that is to be sure that there is some cooperative agreements, and that there is no race to capture the resources or to make other countries dependent on the technologies. And I believe that's something that is a kind of a necessary step to be discussed. I don't see that in the communique of the G7. So please accept that I'm trying to explain what would be the best outcome possible, while not being sure that what is exactly negotiable. And so I'm navigating between the desirable and the negotiable. But I really want to stress the fact that there needs to be a conversation on energy security among G7 countries to kind of try to show how much we are already interdependent and need to continue being interdependent and ensuring one another energy security among G7 countries already. And we could come in the further conversation how important that is also for the rest of the world. But I probably other panelists would like to touch upon that.
Great. Thank you, Sébastien. And we will come back to you to elaborate a little bit more on those recommendations in a second round of questions. We'll dive a little bit more into what panelists would see as G7 leadership in this space. But staying for a moment, because I think it's important as we try to be helpful here to the G7 presidency, and as I think about energy security and climate change, what are the different aspects of that connection that should be brought into the conversation? How can this be a way into different aspects where the G7 can show leadership? So over to you, Ian, to give your perspective on how climate change and energy security connect in your mind.
Great. Thanks very much, Patricia. And thank you very much for the invitation to participate today. I'm delighted to be here. And so when I think about energy security and the energy system, and when I think about global climate change, I immediately think there's very close connections between the two. Of course, our current energy system, to be reminded, is 80% supplied by fossil fuels throughout the world. And therefore, it's responsible, the energy system is, for approximately 75% of global climate change that we're addressing. So we have these two very important systems, and they are linked very, very closely. Now, a little bit of a deeper dive as we look at evolving climate change and evolving energy transition. It's important to understand and flag the links between those two as well. So for one, climate change is affecting energy systems. So Australia just had their springtime, or at the end of last year had their springtime, had the hottest spring on record. And therefore they had more energy demand than they were used to. And as a result, their prices went up 100-fold. With hotter weather comes increased air conditioning demand, and that goes to energy demand at the margin, and therefore you've got less security and higher prices. Climate change can affect energy in a variety of ways. We had significant droughts during the first half of 2023 throughout the world, and therefore global hydropower production was down 10% from what it otherwise would have been expected to have met. So that's a reduction of 177 terawatt hours over those 6 months. That number may not mean much to you. That's what Ontario and Quebec were producing together in their electricity systems during those 6 months. So you had that climate change causing that reduction in energy supply, and that energy supply, to preserve security and reliability, had to be met by other sources. And it could well have been fossil fuels, and therefore you might have preserved reliability in terms of security, but you were doing it at the sacrifice of the climate. One other one with regard to the impacts of climate change, here in Ontario, visitors from around the world, we had a bit of an ice storm in the province over the weekend, which continues to cause outages in eastern Ontario. And with increased severe events, not only ice storms, but typhoons and winds and so on and so forth, you're seeing outages in electricity systems increasing to a significant extent. In the US, over the past 10 years, they almost doubled compared to the previous 10 years. And that brings significant economic costs, let alone the social costs, with regard to individual safety and security as well. I'll just offer, Patricia, one last one, and those were a little bit about how climate change is affecting energy system reliability, energy security now. Well, as we think about the future energy system, the energy transition, it's largely accepted that it's going to be a much more decentralized system. It's going to be a system that uses much more digitalization, which is a good thing. And for reasons we can talk about, we'll go from this centralized, distant, secretive energy system to one that is more, potentially more democratic, more decentralized, more distributed. But a security challenge is that there are many more points of attack on that system. I think this morning we heard about the toothbrush connected to the internet, as the case may be. So an energy service there, the electrical toothbrush, might be a point of failure in a system and being able to be attacked by cyber criminals and cyber attacks in some ways. A study from Lloyd's and the University of Cambridge's Center for Risk Studies did a bit of a scenario and seeing what an attack on the US power grid in 15 states and Washington, D.C. could result in. And in their scenario, 93 million people were left without power, and the economic cost, decline in trade, infrastructure collapses, failure of health and safety systems had costs at up to $1 trillion. So we've got energy systems today, and in the future, as we envision energy systems, we've got climate system and the changes it's going on, lots of connections between the two.
Great. Well, I think important point for us to keep on the table that our current energy systems are not secure in the face of climate change as a key point. And then I'm sure we'll come back on the future of distributed energy systems, and perhaps that's something that Professor Munir Khosry will go to. I should say, I meant to mention at the beginning, Munir, that you were, of course, the lead author on the paper which was submitted for this task force on this topic of energy security and climate change. So thank you very much for pulling that paper together. And in fact, Riyad and Michael, also on the screen, are co-authors of that paper. So Munir, I'm going to ask you to comment next on the framing of energy security and climate change together. What do you think we need to keep in mind as we think about these two issues together?
No, thank you so much for having invited. And as you very correctly mentioned, I was very privileged to lead a brilliant team. And two of the members you see, Riyadh is there, Michael is there. Professor Baumang was also there. I mean, as you said, she must have attended, and it's pretty late in this part of the world. So I'm sure he had his fair share of a contribution. But definitely, I've been very privileged to be with brilliant minds in this sector. I think I would put it this way. This whole dimension of energy and security has so dramatically changed in last 1 or 2 decades that they're very interrelated. I mean, traditionally, if you look back 10 years back, when we talked about energy security, we usually used to mean availability, access, affordability. And then came about a decade back, the SDG 7, that is affordable and clean energy. But what has happened in the last 10 years, geopolitics, supply chain disruptions, wars, these have so fundamentally changed the landscape that these two have become very highly interconnected. So whether it's G7 or G20, we cannot overlook the fact that when we talk about energy security or energy and climate change, they're so highly interrelated. It's very important for us to have a framework which brings in not only access to affordable clean energy, but the climate action part, the climate finance part, the climate resilient infrastructure part. And if you just look at what's happening around the world, that's enough to tell you what's going on and what needs to be done. I'll give you a recent example. As you know, in 2022, in our neighborhood, Pakistan had one of the severest floods. 2/3 of the country was underwater. A serious disruption on hydropower, and the whole energy system got very badly disrupted. You look back, flashback 2017, if you remember, in your neighborhood in Puerto Rico, there was this Hurricane Maria, and the country really paid a heavy price for having over-centralized fossil fuel-based infrastructure, and millions of people were without power for months. The reason I'm citing these examples that these two issues, climate change effect and access to energy we need to carry forward our daily life, have become so interconnected that we do not have the option and luxury to look at them separately. Now, having said that, when it comes to platform like G7, as we know, seven most industrialized, developed democratic economies, and they have at their disposal significant amount of resources, financial, geopolitical, technology, innovation, so on and so forth. So that means it automatically a significant portion of responsibility from leads from the front falls on G7. Now we are all aware of the reality within G7. We have different political dimensions with some of the recent changes in leadership in your neighborhood. There's a different kind of look at energy security, and it's at times difficult for any presidency, whether it's Canada or France, to pull it together and find a coherent voice. I think our job in this community is to raise the stakes to our leadership and flag the thing that needs to be flagged. And at the same time, I wouldn't want to sound like a doomsday doctor and also give you some good news. We have seen where G7 has taken a lead in energy security and tying with climate change, good things have happened. For example, if you look at how UK, US, and Germany have supported countries like South Africa, Indonesia in just energy transition partnership, they have done a remarkable job. And another example, South Africa, which is currently heading the G20 presidency, has had Germany and France come together in helping it phase out coal use by 2030. The reason I'm pushing the boundaries, and you alluded to my involvement in G7, G20, so I thought I would be in a good position to push the boundaries a little bit, that Canada, while it leads the G7, is in a good position to connect with G20 South Africa. And I've seen both the countries have a lot of common themes pushing it together. So if that connection can be made, and given that, what is happening in the world, this would be a very good way to gradually evolve into a global framework with people like Riyadh heads out of UN to make their life easy when we come to this platform and take it to them. Because end of the day, UN itself cannot do anything until we make it a little more easier for them to bring it together. So I took this option, Patricia, to push the boundaries a little bit. If we can sort of find a way to connect with the South Africans, and I know South Africa is working very hard, and you have 4 successive presidencies from the global South. You had Indonesia, then you had India, you had Brazil, this is South Africa. So Canada is a very good position to take that, bring it together, and then it goes to the COP rounds. And my personal take on COP has been, in many cases, we have fallen behind. If you look at what has happened, many of the fossil fuel activists have taken over the climate activists. So we have to find a way to sort of address those issues. So those are 3-4 major nodal points I thought I would touch base. I'm sure people like Michael and Riyadh will bring in their insights. So those will be my very initial comments as to how I look into this whole security dimension and the overarching globality of things. And starting from US, Canada, to South Africa, Brazil, it's a whole big family. So the stakes are very high. We have to find ways to come together, even at a minimum level. And people like Riyadh has a responsibility and the onus on their shoulder to find that common language to which we all can agree. And whether it's a war in Ukraine or we are fighting with critical, rare earth material in China or Russia, we find a common language so that at the end of the day, no matter which part of the world you are, people have access to energy, and that's secured in every possible sense. So I hope I've done justice to your expectation, Patricia, in the initial remarks, but very happy to bounce with other colleagues after the first round of comments. Thank you.
Oh, that's great, Munir. Thank you. And I'd like really to come back on how the G7 can be a platform for cooperation with the Global South on this question and with the G20 as well. So let's definitely come back on that. But I want to go now to Sarah. You've worked on a full range of climate issues on adaptation. You've been involved in the IPCC and heading up the Waterloo Climate Institute. You really got a very full perspective on climate, and I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on how you connect climate with energy security, or security more broadly, perhaps. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. This is a really interesting panel so far, and I'm hearing some common themes, which is always heartening, and I think will make for some interesting discussion as we go. So I'm going to put on my IPCC hat, actually. So for those of you who don't know, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is this global scientific collaboration, the goal of which is to periodically, excruciatingly assess essentially the state of the art on climate science and social science and synthesize it into a format that can inform global treaty making on climate change, including the Paris Agreement, but also directly informs national level climate change policies and actions on down to city scale. You see the IPCC sort of referred back to as this authoritative voice on what's changing in climate, where emissions are headed, where those emissions come from, and what we do to protect communities and ecosystems and adapt to a changing climate. So I was a lead author of the last assessment cycle, the 6th assessment cycle, and I'll get to why this is important, is that I'll be a lead author of the first special report on cities, climate change in cities, which IPCC has never done. So the role of urban landscapes and what that means for energy security and resilience is really coming to the front of mind in this next IPCC assessment cycle. So a couple of points that I just think are really important to reiterate from the 6th assessment cycle that concluded in 2022, we're now just launching the 7th, is that, as we all, I'm sure, know in this room, we are not on track to reducing emissions at the pace and scale necessary to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, to keep that warming under the sort of 2-degree threshold, 2 degrees above pre-industrial averages. So we're just not moving fast enough, which should be a little bit of a, yet another wake-up call that we need accelerated progress. However, for the first time ever, one of the key findings from the IPCC, which I find really heartening and important for our energy security more broadly, is that we now have solutions, existing solutions in every sector that could get us onto the right track. And there's about a dozen, maybe 18-ish countries that actually have successfully reduced their emissions at the pace and scale necessary, if we all did it, to limit warming at the pace we need. And what that means is that there are paths to follow. It's not the same universe we were in 20 years ago, when we didn't know what would work and we had sort of no map ahead. There are actual solutions that work and pathways to follow. So I think that that's really important. To bring this back to energy security, in my view, we've done a deep disservice, and this is why I'm heartened by some key points others have made. We've done a deep disservice in setting energy and greenhouse gas emissions over here. Reducing them is sort of one set of tasks, and then over here we have risks and impacts and adaptation to climate change, and never the two shall meet. And of course, especially with your comments, Ian, we realize that that is just absolutely not true. We have to adapt to a changing climate at the same time while we simultaneously and rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that means ensuring that our energy supply chains are resilient in light of, enhanced, escalated, accelerating extreme events. But it also means that as we're trying to protect communities from heat waves, from drought and whatever, we're doing that in a deeply low carbon way. So in my view, energy security means not just addressing the risks that might emerge from decarbonization, because of course that introduces new critical minerals that we need access to. That includes some volatility and economic transitions in jobs. There are risks to decarbonization and costs, of course. But it also means broadening our view to protecting communities from the impacts of climate change. So both the adaptation and mitigation side. And so in my view, a human security lens is actually more inclusive and more fruitful than a very narrow kind of technocentric view of energy security that focuses mostly on the technologies, the supplies of resources, and perhaps the supply chains, to thinking about how we are collectively cultivating an energy system that offers dignity, that offers robust livelihoods, that is a means of survival, and that also, cuts climate change off at the head. And to deliver on human security as allies, as within the G7, I think a collective vision of that security is important, aiming for collective resilience and reiterating the absolute dire necessity of collaboration and trust rather than isolationism. There's just absolutely no universe in which we can tackle climate change through the lens of isolationism. This problem is just too long-term and too multifaceted to do that. So those are just a couple of the themes that I'd like to pick up as we keep discussing. Thanks.
Great, Sarah. Thank you so much. The human security lens is, I think, a key message out of that. Okay, so let's go to Michael now. Let's have your thoughts, Michael, on this question. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. And of course, on a panel like this, it's challenging to go after so many brilliant colleagues, but also heartening, as Sarah said, to see so many themes that I would have raised already put on the table. And in particular, I was especially happy to hear her emphasis on the adaptation issues and how they're relevant. I thought what I could do, one of the roles that I play sometimes is as a senior advisor to countries in the Alliance of Small Islands Developing States. And I thought, what would they have the G7 think about in the area of the connection between climate change and energy security? So I want to just make 4 brief points, 3 of which have been covered, but maybe the 4th a little less so. The first is just to emphasize that maybe it goes without saying, but increasing renewable energy is intrinsically increasing security because it's decoupling the energy system from other countries. It's something that can be generated more locally. So beyond what the many small islands and other middle income countries around the world would like to see, I mean, they would like the G7, I think, to think about the energy security of G7 countries is good for climate change intrinsically because it increases renewables. And this is one of the things called for in the the outcome. I think someone, maybe Munir, mentioned the decision of COP28 from the global stocktake that actually calls for tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency. So then the second piece and the flip side of that is tripling renewables is terrific, but if you've ever been on a diet, you can't just eat more salad. You also have to eliminate the ice cream. And so it's really important that the tripling the renewables and the, great strides have in fact been made in the increase of renewables isn't just adding more capacity. We also need to be really systematic, more systematic than we have been in dismantling the fossil fuel based energy system. So I know it's a late hour already especially for those in Asia, but you'll remember the salad and ice cream point. The third thing I wanted to say is that this is the human impacts point. There's a sort of, it's a negative positive feedback loop, which is that and again, this was mentioned, but the heat waves are increasing, and sure, it's bad in Australia when it's really hot, but just set your mind for a moment in, say, Kashmir, and it could be this year that there's an extended period of 35-degree wet bulb temperature, so that's 35 degrees with 100% humidity, or hotter with a little bit lower humidity. That's a temperature at which you cannot survive outside. And that's a temperature which you have to essentially be underground or in air conditioning or something. And we're teetering on that. And I think this is a finding of the IPCC that's very clear and not, widely discussed, but I think really, really important to understand. So simultaneously, that's the result of our climate inaction thus far. And it's also something that unfortunately often requires increased energy or radically different approaches to adaptation in order to deal with it. So I think that that is a perspective that, countries that aren't Australia or Canada or the United States, that don't have a lot of air conditioning and other kinds of cooling centers, that do face these kinds of temperatures. And in fact, these temperatures have been faced in the United States, and people have died in Chicago from heat waves. But, it is really terrifying to think that 35 degrees wet bulb is not compatible with human life. And we're right at the edge of that. And the last thing, which hasn't been mentioned, is, and I'm sure that we will come back to this, but is climate finance. So even in the G20, it's, G13 through G20, as opposed to the G7, really rely on climate finance that is often not self-generated. And great strides have been made in the last few years, especially in the reform of the MDBs and really thinking about this issue to understand how like the large sources of capital could be driven in the right direction. But this is, I think, one of the things that may be a victim of fragmentation in the G7. And this is certainly something that, even without that, was teetering on the edge. And some of the really great initiatives, like the one spearheaded by Prime Minister Carney, GFANs, have fallen apart recently. So I think that we need to, if developing countries or small islands could be speaking to the G7, I think they would say, like, not just, let's not just think about small amounts of increases to grants for climate finance, but really substantive reforms to the entire international system, to the way the Bretton Woods institutions organize, to the way that we think about climate finance, such that we can actually deliver. Because there are some really big countries in the world that are just coming online with lots of air conditioning and computers and everything else, and the demands are going to be really great if we don't get our hands around it. Thank you.
Great, super. And you're right, financing will, I think, for sure be an important element when we get to what are we asking the G7 to do, which we'll get to in just a moment. Before we do that, I'd like to go to Riyadh. Please give us your perspective on this topic.
Thank you very much. Let me say one thing based on what Michael said, especially on small island developing state and the finance part. And one element which is essential where G7 can really play a role is taking into account the multidimensional vulnerability index for the small island developing states, taking into account the reality of this group of countries will be able for those countries to save 1.5% of GDP. This is a reality. This is how we can make really a difference. And when you said how we can frame energy security in climate change, I see a three level, including one which was mentioned by Munir on the North-South cooperation, and South-North cooperation. And the first one is on the how climate change is affecting security, and building climate smart energy system is a development imperative. It is not a choice. An energy system designed around past climate patterns are no longer reliable. It's not possible. So global renewable capacity grew by a record of 585 gigawatt in 2024, based on IRENA last studies, which represent over 90% of all new power added worldwide. The fastest annual growth rate in the two last decades. However, take note in 2023, the impact of El Nino and global warming disrupt rainfall, wind, solar pattern worldwide, reducing wind generation between 20 to 30% in Africa. But on the other side, was causing gains in solar output in South America. So that need to be taken into account. In Sudan, Namibia, and I think one of my predecessor, probably Sebastien, that hydropower output dropped by more than 50% due to unusually low rainfall. Those are countries where hydropower makes up around 60% of the electricity mix. This reduction could have significant implication, and what one of our predecessors said, the impact on livelihood, the impact on human being, the impact on education, the impact on health. The second element that I think is important is the energy security. Energy by itself is affecting climate change. Climate change is a market failure. Emission already in the atmosphere could reduce global GDP per capita up to 29% by 2050. It's huge, 1/3. And hitting the most vulnerable country hardest. And in 2023 alone, extreme weather event affected at least 93 million people. And Munir mentioned the case of Pakistan just 2 years ago. This is the reality. And on what you said, Michael, in the Pacific country, in a small island developing state, climate disasters have increased 8-fold over the past decade. 8-fold. And through the Pacific Green Transformation Project that we are handling now in the Pacific, 1,000 remote households in PNG, Timor-Leste, Vanuatu, and Samoa now are gaining solar energy, turning access to electricity into catalyst for education, for resilience, for long-term development. But energy security and climate resilience are more interconnected than ever. Only by designing adaptive, diversifying, and inclusive energy system can we protect communities, we drive development and achieve climate goals in a rapidly changing world. And as you mentioned, the G7 energy security cannot be achieved in isolation from the global south, from the discussion that's happening now in South Africa and just before in Brazil. A region that holds the bulk of the world renewable energy potential and where demand is expected to grow in a very, very fast way. It's going to be the fastest. Southeast Asia alone is set to account 25% of the global energy demand growth by 2035, with emerging economies driving the majority of the projected 4% annual rise in the global electricity demand through 2027. At the same time, this region are also among the most vulnerable to climate risk, facing increasingly severe weather event and disruption to energy infrastructure. This makes the case for deeper collaboration very clear. This is what we call for G7, a deeper collaboration. To secure global energy resilience, the G7 must work hand in hand with the global south. And I agree with you, Munir. It's very important. Mobilizing capital, technology, policy support to unlock clean energy access while building climate resilient system in the area that we need the most. And behind each numbers that we said now, we have human being. And at the end, climate security, energy security should be around human development. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Riyad. Okay, so against that background of all of those interconnections, vulnerability of current energy systems to the impact of climate change, the energy system currently is a driver of climate change, the impacts on human security that Sarah and Riyad have really underlined, thinking about what the energy system of the future needs to look like. So all of that, with all of that context, let's go to what we want the G7 to do in this space to try to really zero in on actual recommendations. And I'll start with you again, Sébastien. You referred in your initial remarks to efficiency and sufficiency, and I know you'll also probably have something today to say on financing, but really I'd like all of you just to sort of give your, and I'm sure there'll be some overlap, so we can kind of collect the list as long as we go through it, but I'd like to come through this round with, in an ideal world, because we'll come back in a moment on kind of where the common ground may be in this complicated context, especially with the United States now. But what, setting that aside, what should the G7 be doing at this time in the space of energy security and climate change? So, Sébastien, to you first.
Thanks a lot, Patricia. And I feel privileged to be the first to speak, beginning the list, but I will try to also account for some of the policy briefs that we've gathered, you and me and the other co-chairs for this task force. So, of course, it would be very important that the G7 subscribes to a very large definition of energy security. And I mean, many of the panelists mentioned that it's a question of human security and not just a question of pure technical security, but by having a large enough definition of energy security to which they would add their support between allies, as so far as we can continue to say that the G7 are allied countries. And from Europe, it does not seem like that, but this is something that we need to try and foster anyway. That energy security matters between allies in the G7 and also as the G7 leaders group to try and provide their support financially, technologically, technical assistance to the rest of the world. including a definition of energy security that includes the issues of not just providing more supply, but also more decarbonized supply because it's renewables, because they're decentralized, and this is about connectivity, infrastructure, and it's also about efficiency and demand management. That would be absolutely critical. In particular, I mean, in Europe, we want to get rid of Russian gas, but we don't want to be hooked up on American LNG. We want to be energy sovereign, and in that regard, we need to be really looking at sufficiency and renewables as something that goes hand in hand. And I believe there could be ways to frame that in an acceptable way for all G7 members. I just wanted to account for two other issues that we received in the policy briefs. One was looking at the issue of climate finance, but not directly through climate finance in the for instance, the Brazilian G20 roadmap on MDBs for climate and for development, but through the issue of debt. I believe this is something that ideally the G7 could be looking at. How do you look at debt resolution in order to avoid a disaster? To increase disaster resilience, and I don't say climate resilience, we could say of any other type of disaster, but also economic shocks, geopolitical shocks. So how do you ensure that the countries that are facing debt to the extent that they can't even pay the salaries of their doctors or their teachers, how is it that they can really face this debt issue? The G7 countries cannot play that alone because this is a G20 issue also. In the frame that is dealt with the common framework in the G20. This is a South African priority. And I believe this would be very good that the G7 supports the efforts of South Africa in their G20 presidency on debt. Last point, we received very interesting suggestions on investments. Some policy papers asking for a new regime on investment agreements between countries. Because what we see in my organization, talking to African think tanks, is that what they badly need is access for finance for their investments for sustainable development. And actually, the flows of investments are flowing back to the countries that develop their industrial policies, like the IRA was in the US, but also the new industrial policy in Europe, or the ones that exist in China or in Japan and South Korea. And so there is something about how do we reimagine the possibility to have an agreement on investments. And I think that's something that was dropped 20 years ago, and that might be quite important in terms of getting to energy security, to energy access for all, but also to deal with the problem of the climate impacts if we want to have investments in Brazil's infrastructure. So I don't go into detail of that proposal, but just to say that this could be ideally a subject where the G7 could be leading.
Thank you, Sébastien. All right, Ian, over to you for your wish list.
Great, thanks very much. And leadership can, of course, be exerted in many different ways. And I'm based at a university and sitting among think tank leaders. I'm going to flag that deep collaboration in order to advance research for action and impact and very positive outcomes could be an impactful role for the G7 to show leadership. So when I think of research on the climate change challenge, on the energy transition challenge, I first of all don't want it to be an excuse for inaction, and that's why I talked about the chain of impact. And then I think about three different areas of kinds of research. First of all, climate change, energy transitions are a near-term game, near-term issue, a longer-term issue as well. To get to net zero by 2050, we need to transform our systems. And it's largely accepted that the last 20 or 30% of that transformation will be the so-called tough nuts to crack. Be that aviation, be that high temperature heat for industrial processes, be that other kinds of technologies in development to address those challenges. But the action needs to take place now because research is a longer game in that regard. So I'll offer that as one of three areas, call it discovery research to address the challenges, and deep collaboration to advance that now. A second of the three areas is we need research and application. So if discovery science makes their innovation, finds new knowledge, you need to advance it on the technology readiness levels. And in order to do that, it's a journey and it's not deterministic. You need multidisciplinary teams, you need pilot projects, you need reflexivity, you need resilience, learning by doing. So I'll offer that as a second of the three buckets. And then the third bucket, which I think picks up upon one of Sarah's points, we know a lot of the technological things that can be deployed effectively now. But as Sarah also mentioned, and as some comments of many people have said, we're not on the path to do that. We're not on the path to bend the curve of emissions at this point. So a third area is about research and deployment, which means that the social landscape has to be front and center. So this means things like understanding markets, understanding governance, understanding regulations, understanding education, individual agency, societal structure. All of these are critical to understand. And collaborative work that's rigorous, theoretically informed, and empirically tested will be important. So my call, Patricia, is for that deep collaboration in those three different buckets of research going forward. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Okay, Munir, I'm going to go to you next. Tell us what. Oh, and we have Bambang, who's joined us as well. So, but I'll just give you a moment to settle in there, Bambang. We'll come to you in a moment. So, Munir, go ahead.
I think some of the things have been mentioned, and I think as very correctly flagged, the research and at least in my opinion, at least 0.1% of GDP of the G7 countries should go into that, because can you guys hear me? Because it's very eerily silent here.
We can hear you.
Okay, because fine. Okay, so the thing is, I think, and also one of the things I think we have to take into cognizance that G7 has a very important role in shaping some of the policy regulatory issues that affects both energy security and climate change. In spite of some of the challenging times because of changing the political landscape that's happening in your neighborhood, the challenges on the ground, the difficulty that we face remains the same. Change in political leadership does not change anything as far as the imminent danger we're facing in terms of climate change and how that intersects with energy. Now, having said that, in my opinion, some of the low-hanging fruits, which can be decoupled from the geopolitics, when it is under the presidency of like Canada and France, I would encourage try to fast forward those areas which are little immune to geopolitics. For example, one of the thing is we should really explore cross-border energy trades compliant with the SDG 7. For example, say many countries, this new dimension of hydrogen, green hydrogen energy, which we are seeing collaboration bilateral level between a G7 country, Japan, a G20 country, India. Then we see the opportunity for cross-border energy corridors, which can happen with, say, Chile, and then Argentina, South Africa coming together and catering to energy hubs like, say, Germany or France. So those kind of low-hanging fruits, which can avoid the geopolitics of it, we should try to press hard. Secondly, Sarah mentioned the human dimension. I think this discussion will incomplete. One of the facts we have historically overlooked, gender dimension of energy security. If you look around the world, women play a disproportionately significantly high role in terms of energy access. If you look at go to any rural village in Africa, South Asia, Latin America, but at a social dimension, that role has not been properly recognized and they have not been properly empowered. If you look at the case of Bangladesh, for example, the success of solar home system is largely attributable to women who took the lead to put the system in place. And there are other good examples. So I would tend to say that's another dimension we have to factor in. Then also, diversification is very important. As the Ukraine war showed us that what Europe did many decades ago is ultimate price Europe paid when this whole Ukraine war broke out and this dependency on Russian energy supply, I mean, it showed that. So what we are seeing, a lot of interesting trends. For example, we have seen Japan collaborating with EU, trying to cut down reliance on critical rare elements of countries like China and Russia. We are seeing the similar thing, US investing heavily in Australia and other countries to fill up that gap. So these things will shape up the landscape in a very silent, subtle way. And I think it's our job as a think tank is to not to hesitate to come out with pragmatic solution, independent with the geopolitics of all it. Because I tend to continue to be optimistic, and even within those difficult circumstances under which we are operating, I think some of the examples I mentioned, where G20, G7, North, South, developed economics like US, Germany, France, and developing countries, middle powers like South Africa, Brazil. And I must mention that these countries, South Africa, Brazil, India, Indonesia, they will increasingly play an important role for a number of reasons. Number one, and they will be one of the important arch of energy security for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you look at the size of the population they represent, if you look at their access to natural resources, if you look at their location geographically, it's a really strategic player. So you will see the rise of these countries, and 4 successive years of G20, starting with Indonesia, which Professor Bambang was at that time head of the task force of SDG, ending into South Africa. These are very important dotted lines we need to connect. The reason I'm pushing this hard, you see, no matter how much academic discussion research we do, if we really want it to be impactful, we have to connect with those stakeholders. Unless we do that, challenging is difficult, but while without compromising the academic rigors and nuances, we should not hesitate and we should not shy to call spade a spade. Otherwise, there's no part of this exercise. And we have seen there are a lot of good examples shared about. So I would wrap up with this, Patricia, as does the human dimension, which Sarah alluded to, is very important. On the other end, the geopolitical dimension and how it affects energy security, how it affects climate change, we need to take into cognizance and pick those low-hanging fruits where we can forge ahead, independent of the changing political landscape, which is part of living in democracies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Munir. Great. I think the idea of energy corridors as an area for collaboration in this context is quite interesting. So, Bambang, thank you for joining us, and we'd like to ask you for your thoughts on what the G7 should be committing to in relation to energy security and climate change.
Yeah. Let me focus on the, first, how to avoid the debate between, not the debate, how to avoid a possible conflict between climate and energy security. Because yes, at one side, energy security is very important, especially for supporting economic growth. On the other hand, there should be kind of climate action in order to mitigate the worst impact of climate change. And sometimes there is a trade-off between them. But in fact, G7 can focus on how climate and energy security can be unifying. How can we unify between climate and energy security? First and foremost, we can emphasize on phasing down fossil fuel dependence as a goal. And of course, when we are trying to phasing down the fossil fuel dependence, especially coal and oil, then every country, every region, and of course, even every G7 member countries will try different path. And we should give some kind of local wisdom for every country in the world, trying to use less fossil fuel, either coal or oil. Some might use nuclear, some might, push on wind, some might use solar, some even using carbon capture, and some others could be utilizing bioenergy or mixing between coal and bioenergy. So with that kind of flexibility, I believe all G7 members, as well as every country in the world, should agree on the end state of a net zero and clean energy future. So that's how we trying to unify between climate action and energy security. And of course, this kind of common vision allows joint action, such as collective commitments to cut methane emission, cooperating on strategic petroleum reserve to prevent price shocks during the transition, and of course, mutual aid for energy crisis. And I think it happens, for example, when countries, especially in Europe, trying to use the alternate for the cut of ship gas transportation from Russia to different parts of Europe back in 2022. So it means that during the transitional period, solidarity among countries that have common goals in unifying climate and energy security is very much critical. So I believe G7 will play a significant role when it comes to the global goal of net zero and clean energy in the future. Thank you.
Bambang, and I should have introduced you. I know you were with us earlier, but just to say that Bambang Brojo Negoro is the incoming dean of the Asian Development Bank Institute and professor of economics at the University of Indonesia and a former finance minister for Indonesia. So I want to go to Sarah for your thoughts now, your wish list for what you'd like to see the G7 do.
Sounds good. I have 6 items on my wish list, but I'll try and be super brief. Picking up on the 3 buckets introduced by Ian, I'd like to add a potential 4th bucket that responds to some comments from Manur, and maybe it was implicit in your 3rd bucket, but supporting what I would call transdisciplinary research. So I know there's so many like multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, whatever. Transdisciplinary for me has a very specific meaning, which is that we collaborate first across disciplines. So we need, energy systems engineers working with sociologists and psychiatrists, not so much psychologists, to understand why and how we use energy and how we build our values around the use of energy and what it would take to shift those habits and this kind of thing. Anyway, so across disciplines, but crucially, working with civil society actors, with individuals, with stakeholders of all sorts to shape the questions that we ask in close collaboration with them as researchers, instead of saying, I have a question, this really tickles me and this is what I'm going to work on, rather asking, what do you need our research? What service can we provide through our research? And then having social and ecological benefit as intentional outcomes of the research, rather than kind of happy accidents of research that may or may not be applied. So that kind of work is desperately needed. I think we're deeply out of touch in think tanks and universities if that's not at least some of what we're doing. So that's number 1. Number 2 is that given what the IPCC tells us about already having many of the solutions that we need and pathways to follow, the G7 plays a crucial role in sharing and accelerating the uptake of best practices. So that is absolutely something that can be done among the G7, not just technological best practices, but also the policies, the incentives, the behavior change levers that have worked already in some contexts, so that we can do more of that faster. I think it was to Michael's point, but accelerating climate finance and following through on the existing commitments so that we have a more just and equitable global energy system, given where responsibility for the existing levels of climate change lie, et cetera. Is this number 4? Yep. So number 4 would be sort of returning to the G7's role as a deepener of norms, as an enhancer of collaboration, some of those norms being, of course, related to a rules-based democratic order. But given the rhetoric that we're hearing out of the United States, which is very, obviously it's America first, it's power through strength, it's isolationist. That was my read on it, at least. Using the G7 to reiterate and deepen a vision of collective resilience that is not zero-sum. The resilience of one nation enhances the resilience of another nation. This is obvious, I would say, but nonetheless needs to be reiterated. 2 more. One, to Michael's ice cream analogy, which will stick with me, unfortunately, although I deeply love ice cream. Energy efficiency is by far the least sexy thing to talk about. We always talk about, new and exciting renewable energy sources, but energy efficiency is just the most obvious way to reduce our dependence on the fossil fuels that we already rely on while we transition to more renewables. And finally, the G7 has an important role, I think, in directing our attention to the root causes of high emissions pathways and highly vulnerable pathways. And at least one of those root causes is systemic inequality. And if we're not drawing attention to how systemic inequality leads to both geopolitical instability as well as highly vulnerable communities, I think we're kind of missing the bigger point. So those are my 7, 6. Anyway, it's my list.
Great. Almost one for each country. Great. Okay. So now let me go to Michael for your thoughts on this question.
Well, thank you so much. So I want to just echo Sarah that we basically already, I'm sorry, I'm hearing an echo back to me. So I don't know if that's my side or yours. There we go. Much better. So I think, we do pretty much know what to do, both certainly on the mitigation side and frankly, at least there are a lot of ideas for adaptation. If IPCC is a great source, but even more readable if you want to know on the mitigation side is Project Drawdown. So drawdown.org. It's a good exercise on if we got religion tomorrow, what would we do? But I mean, just to echo something that Sarah said in her framing, but to maybe put it slightly differently, there's sort of two things that we need on top of, knowing the concrete actions. One is social norms need to change, and with them politics, and the other is finance. So I'm not going to really say much about social norm change, except to say, to give you an example. So something that should be a really easy both adaptation and mitigation measure for everybody to do, certainly in North America, but also largely around the world, would be regenerative agriculture. So it's cheaper, it's healthier for the farmers. It's a great mitigation measure. It increases this carbon content in the soil, and lots of other great things. Often not adopted, and farmers know this too. Often not adopted because of a kind of stigma against not plowing your field or something. And so one of really creative people like the Rodale Institute actually bring farmers to their farm and show them what this looks like. But one of the things I think, in terms of the plug for social science and climate circles, is there is a literature about social norm change. A colleague of mine at Penn, Christina Bicchieri, has a wonderful book called Norms in the Wild, which looks at this. But I think huge attention should be paid at the technical level to how norms had changed. At the political level, when we're talking G7, I think, really thinking about how do you make these policies stick? Well, they stick when there's political pressure to keep them sticking. And how does that happen? Well, by, changing certain social norms. So I think that would be, somewhat out, it's not the typical G7 kind of thing, but it would be worth a thought. A more typical G7 kind of thing, and what I know actually a lot more about is finance, which is weird because my mother always told me, I only know how to spend money, not make it. That's why I became a professor and, everything else. But in terms of, things that G7 should do, I mean, just a couple. The first is that the really important outcome out of Baku was this thing called the NCQG, the New Collective Quantified Goal. And it's really lots of different goals. And it's actually like it's even if you don't like reading UN documents, worth reading because it's actually really subtle and interesting in all kinds of ways. I think the press really misunderstood it quite a lot, but there are like two core commitments in it, and both of which will require G7 leadership. The first is a core commitment to in kind of UN climate speak, provide financing of $300 billion per year. This is tied to Article 9.1C of the Paris Agreement, and that is to say, actually find a way to count via contributions to climate funds, bilateral aid, contributions to the multilateral development banks, $300 billion per year, up from $100 billion per year, which was a stretch to get to and only has recently been achieved. So that's, I think it would be great to see the G7, double, triple down on that commitment, which they made just a few months ago. And then the second part of that NCQG was something even more ambitious, more diffuse and ephemeral, and that was to mobilize, using UN speak, meaning catalyze the delivery of, but not directly provide, $1.3 trillion per year, which is the thing that that's estimated that's actually needed. And that's, I think it would be really important to see G7 reaffirming that commitment to the mobilizing 1.3 trillion, but more importantly, and a place I think people like us can contribute to, is actually beginning to give a roadmap on how that's possible. So there is an item that's being negotiated called the Baku to Belém roadmap that sort of looks at this. But the truth is, the Brazilian presidency of COP30 would be delighted to have lots of ideas from this kind of a crowd. And I think that it's important for the G7 leaders to send political signals in this direction. They certainly will be necessary at COP30. The second part of this, I think, I'm actually not sure which one of you said this, but I wrote it down as you said. It's a very, very important point that middle-income countries in particular cannot take the kind of climate action we'd like to see them take, especially on the adaptation side, but also on the mitigation side, because they lack fiscal space. And this is due to very high levels of indebtedness. So even relatively wealthy countries, like upper middle income countries like Maldives, they're borrowing at 15%. So this is not something that you can ask a country to then, on top of the commitments they already have, increase resilience measures beyond the ones that they have, or affect their energy transition. So lots of good ideas were in the G20 communique last year. There's lots of ideas. There's the Nairobi Declaration. There's the Bridgetown Agenda. So there are definitely, there's the World Bank Evolution Roadmap. There are lots of ideas in the air about how to increase fiscal space particular for middle income countries. But it's probably even less sexy than energy efficiency is working on debt. And for some countries, it's downright toxic to even mention debt because of where debt is held in the world. And so I think that is something that would be very, very important and very concrete and less expensive than other things for the G7 to think about. And then finally, I actually think we need creative thinking that hasn't really been done yet on adaptation finance. So I don't think it's impossible to finance adaptation measures. When I say finance, I mean find additional sources of capital to flow towards adaptation projects. But it's certainly not as easy because ultimately renewable energy projects are generators of revenue, and so even as long as they can be placed in relatively stable parts of the world, you can generally attract private capital towards them. It's been much harder to explain how this is possible in adaptation. So I think both research is needed here, but also strong signals from the G7 that we want more creative thinking about adaptation finance. And we recognize that these are things that municipalities are often doing, but nevertheless, we realize that if we're going to actually protect humans and ecosystems and infrastructure and their health and everything else down the road, it's better to front load. It's better to do these things now. It'll be far more expensive later. So again, I mentioned as a kind of both interesting but unfortunately ultimately failed example, GFANZ, Prime Minister Carney's, I think still great achievement. It's worth deep study of that, what worked, what didn't work, how to do the next generation of this to make it less vulnerable, but also how to increase its scope to hit the resilience measures and not just for mitigation. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I think that mobilizing private finance is an area we understand that is under discussion. So underlining the opportunity around creative approaches to adaptation financing is really welcome in this discussion. Riyadh, to you, please. One thing that has not come up yet in our recommendations is anything to do with critical minerals. So I don't know if that might be on your list, but go ahead, Riyadh, in terms of what you would like to see the G7 do.
Thank you very much. And I want to jump on one element that, again, Michael mentioned. The one is the debt, which is a reality when we ask the countries to respond to the UA consensus on the tripling renewable energy and doubling energy efficiency, and the COP29 coming with a proposal on financing. Yes, but this is not enough. The reality, the environment of the not only middle-income country, I can talk about high-income countries who are highly indebted, and highly vulnerable. Take all the Caribbeans. This is the reality of a number of countries. All the seats together is 20% of our General Assembly. This is important. And I think if we do not tackle that as a G7, we're going to keep the same problem all the time. The second element where I think we can play, the G7 can play a role, is its ability to translate its own ambition into action, into implementation. And not only about financing, it's also about the role of the private sector. Let me try to explain this is a little bit. So, last G7 presidency was by Italy, and they initiated a huge initiative called Energy for Growth in Africa, mobilizing a certain numbers of resources in order to develop a pipeline of bankable projects. It was Kenya, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Zambia, Mozambique. This is a pilot. This G7 need to follow up on the previous one, be much more ambitious, and scale up this beginning of initiative. Because financing exists. What is missing is a pipeline of bankable project. And for attracting private sector, what you said, Patricia, you need to develop a certain numbers of guarantee schemes. That is the only way that you can get the private sector to invest. So you de-risk in one side financially, and you do the policy de-risking, what UNDP is currently doing in all the countries. That is one element. The second element is clean energy investment rose by 11% the past year. But do you know that 90% of the increase has taken place only in advanced economies and in China? That's it, less than 2% in Africa. Meanwhile, we always talk about the 685 million people without access to electricity, but you have 1.18 billion people energy poor. And it is a question of affordability that we need to put on the table and for the G7 to tackle. It is not only the problem of access, it's also the problem of affordability. Together with the G7, we can reshape the global energy architecture from grounding ambition, action, making energy fundamental metrics for development, like with the IPCC report. For example, what we are doing currently now in Afghanistan, where we deliver clean solar energy to 3.6 million people by solarizing 5,700 institutions, including 700 schools and health centers, transforming access to education, healthcare to communities. So the G7 leadership means turning ambition into action, delivering clean energy where it is needed the most, but it's also the just energy transition. And I agree one element that you mentioned. What about critical raw materials? Their importance here. Their importance is not only for accelerating the energy transition, for responding to the battery system, for responding to the expansion, rapid expansion, and in an exponential way of the AI. But it is also protecting the nature. Exploitation of critical raw materials has impact on nature. Second, most of the time, it is where indigenous communities lives. What are the benefits of the indigenous communities? At the end, as United Nations Development Program, we come back to one element. It is our focus is on human development. So we hope that the G7 leadership this time will focus on this decision on the human development progress. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Well, we've got, I think, a very good list coming out of all of our panelists, covering everything from approaching this with a large lens, including concepts of human security, to research, to the financing element, to the implementation around things like corridors and best practices, and the deepening of norms around the issue. So a very rich list of suggestions, and we are already very close to time. So let me just throw it open to the audience for questions in the minutes we have remaining. We haven't approached the questions of kind of where the common ground is, so maybe that will come up, or the stakes, how high the stakes are for this G7 on these questions. And we also can take questions online if there are any. I'm looking at Savan. So do you have a question online that you'd like to give us? Savan, go ahead.
Yeah, so we have a question on how do we avoid harms, unintended or otherwise, to the environment, society, and economies as we develop our clean energy sectors?
Okay, that's pretty broad. How do we avoid harms to the environment and society from our energy sector? So harm avoiding. Let's take a question from the audience. I think we'll probably only have time to kind of collect the questions and then have comments from panelists on the ones they want to answer. So there's one here in the green sweater. Yeah, great.
Hi, my name is Tam. I am part of the Young Delegates of Canada, YDC. I am the EDI coordinator. My question's in critical minerals. I was wondering, how do we balance between maintaining a globally competitive critical mineral supply chain at the same time while protecting and investing in the economic and social development of the local communities, especially indigenous community?
Great. Before I go to the panelists, is there perhaps one more question to include? And yes, I see one there. So we've got
linking this back to the previous panel, can we have artificial intelligence and a green transition at the same time?
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to give panelists kind of a choice of which one they'd like to address. The first one was around addressing harms from the energy sector on society and the environment. Second question was around how can we have the development of critical minerals, as I understand it, in a way that's consistent with the rights of indigenous communities and with their participation. And then the question of AI and energy, and how do these systems develop together, or to connect these two topics that we've been talking about today. Great question. So I'll throw it open to whoever would like to jump on whichever of those questions. Do you want to go ahead?
I can tackle the first one very quickly, realizing we have like 3.5 minutes. But how to avoid harms? I would just say that this requires systems thinking. Right? We need to take a more holistic view. A sustainability lens is very helpful in that regard, to understand that we have multiple priorities: biodiversity, poverty, energy security, responding to impacts. If we do a better job of thinking about those things simultaneously, we can try at least to avoid maladaptation and unintended consequences. And secondly, having more voices at the table. So if there are systematically underrepresented voices, you're going to be negligent, and you will not understand the full range of potential unintended consequences. So deeper, more participatory processes at multiple levels, I think, will help with that.
Fantastic, Sarah. I'll go online to our panelists who would like to address any one of those questions. Yes, Munir, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to address the third one, AI. Just a very quick five-step to the gentleman who asked it. I'm glad he raised it because I was just thinking that's one of the areas somehow we didn't notice the technology innovation, particularly led by AI. To answer to your question, first step of the five would be, which actually we did highlight in our policy brief, is the data infrastructure development. I mean, G7 can definitely lead in establishing standardized protocols for energy data collection, storage, and sharing across G7 nations. Second is obviously capacity building. So we need to develop the AI workforce development, which specializes in particular energy transition, energy security, and the climate aspect of it. Third is the regulatory framework. We know there's a lot of ongoing debate on the regulatory framework on AI. As far as energy is concerned, we need to pay close attention to create common, for example, G7 standard for AI application in critical energy infrastructure with particular emphasis on security and reliability. The fourth one would be, as obviously, testing and demonstration. How do we have large-scale demonstration which optimizes AI optimized renewable energy system across different regions? The last one is very important, knowledge dissemination. This is something I've spoken with Riyadh a number of times. An open source repository of AI application for renewable energy with documentation. The reason I quickly pointed this five step because this will inevitably come up. And if you look at the quick pace things happen with AI, I think these are the five fundamental steps that I would recommend for adoption or integration of AI moving forward to renewable energy and energy security. Yeah.
Bang Bang, please, over to you next.
Yeah, I believe G7 needs to invest more in the research and development of energy efficiency. So not only we are developing, different types of renewable energy, but we should also emphasize more and invest more for energy efficiency. And part of the R&D for energy efficiency must include AI, because with the AI, then we can ensure our efficiency much better than we used to be, as well as we might find, maybe new and alternative energy because of the AI. So I believe AI will play a critical role in the green and clean energy in the future. Thank you.
Great. Riyadh.
Thank you. And I agree with Munir and Bang Bang. As energy demand expand, AI can optimize the energy system and drive energy efficiency. So that is very clear. For example, in Faroe Island, which is very interesting, this case, is the first to use a virtual power plant for fast frequency demand response, decoupling large industrial units from the main power system and in under a second to prevent blackout. This is a superb example of success and how we can replicate in another country. But there's one element that we need to take into account. The data center currently account for 3% of the global energy consumption. This is equivalent of and emitting CO2. This is equivalent of Brazil alone. And it could reach 21% of the global energy demand by 2030. 21% with the rise of AI.
Good. Yeah, it's a good
But
reminder.
it holds the potential to reduce global emission by up 10% by 2030. The question is the same. It is, we are developing data centers, we are developing AI solutions, but we are using data coming from the global south. How can we create partnership on AI and energy between the solution developed on AI in the north and in the south together, and how we can share the data centers service? Thank you.
Excellent. So it's catching out risks and opportunities around AI. So Ian, would you like a no? Okay. So then we're at time, probably past time. So let me just thank very much the panelists with me here on the stage. Those of you who've been online, thank you especially to those who are in time zone, which is so far ahead of us. Really appreciate you being with us. This has been a fantastic kind of pep talk for our task force as we prepare our recommendations for the G7. So thank you very much for all of the thoughts that you put on the table. Thanks to the audience here, and I think we're now going to drinks. Maybe someone will address the next logistical steps, but thanks very much to all of those of you in the audience as well for being with us this afternoon.